Mr. Fried, what has your huge foreign service career taught you about Russia? What works and what doesn't against Kremlin politics?
I have two principal conclusions about Russia. One is that I do not think that Russia is doomed to live down to its worst historical traditions. I don't think Russia will be always as bad an actor as it is today. But my second impression is that when Russia is in a bad place, when it is acting in an aggressive manner, the free world, if I can use the term, needs to resist its aggression so that we may hasten the day when a better Russia emerges.
More and more people, Western people, politicians, also researchers, also at this conference it was said that the decision at the Bucharest summit of 2008 not to give Georgia, not to offer Georgia a membership action plan was a mistake. Also, many people see the direct link between this decision and the August war in Georgia. How can it be corrected? Or can it be corrected?
I was at Bucharest, so I remember that well. And of course, President Bush and the Poles, the British, the Baltics, and a number of others supported giving Georgia a membership action plan. But the alliance was divided, and in the end, they worked out a compromise which said that Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO. And that's a perfectly reasonable position for the alliance to take. Now, I think you have a point, or at least there's a reasonable argument to be made, that the display of NATO disunity may have encouraged Putin to attack Georgia within a few months that summer. That's possible. But it's also true that giving NATO membership to Georgia is a difficult and complicated decision. It's not easy. If it were easy, we would have done it long ago. But it's not easy. It's a tough decision for the alliance. What we need to be clear about is that we take Georgian sovereignty seriously. Now, I want to make one point. It's not the United States trying to grab Georgia and drag it into NATO. The push for Georgia to get into NATO came from the Georgians themselves, as it should. We don't want people in the alliance unless they want to be in the alliance. And then, if a free people in a democracy want to join NATO, we need to find a way to respond. So that's a dilemma, and it remains with us today.
Yes, Mr. Fried, but the members of NATO should make a decision, final decision about Georgia's membership. And we know that majority of Georgians supports its membership of NATO, its path towards NATO. And that many people also are waiting for the moment when it happens. And that many people wonder when it might happen and in what circumstances.
Right, fair enough. Let's be honest. There is no consensus in the alliance to bring Georgia into NATO, and I think Georgians are perfectly aware of this. And I'm not going to say something that isn't true just to please the people who the Georgians who want to join NATO this very moment. The fact is that NATO's decision that Georgia's ultimate fate, if it chooses, is to join NATO, be a member of NATO, is a perfectly reasonable position. It's also true that where we are now, that decision won't be acted on. Now, what does that mean for Georgia in a practical terms? It means, one, if Georgia wants to, it should hold fast to its objectives. And two, Georgia has the ability to actually start building the infrastructure of alliance membership right now, because military-to-military cooperation is open to Georgia in a way that it was not even remotely open to Poland 30 years ago. So Georgia has some disadvantages and it has certain advantages. And right now, my advice to Georgians would be practical, work at military-to-military ties with the United States and other NATO countries, and above all, work to strengthen the institutions of Georgian democracy, because that will build the political capital Georgia needs, that it can use when the moment becomes right.
May I talk about another issue which is also admitted kind of a mistake of the West? It's a reaction about Russian aggression of 2008, because this reaction differs a lot from the one which was after Ukraine.
Right.
Territory was annexed in 2014. At least, could that be corrected?
Well, I don't know what you mean by a mistake. That is, after the Russo-Georgian War, Russia did not annex territory, but it basically allowed those two breakaway territories. It tried to rip them away from Georgia. So it was also, in a sense, Russia's attempt to change borders by force. Now, the West did not respond with sanctions, as it did after the attack on Ukraine in 2014. And the Bush administration basically was out of time, but what it did instead of sanctions was put together I think it was a $4 billion fund to help support
$4.5 billion.
$4.5 billion based on $1 billion of American money, which the Bush administration organized with the support of then Senator and Vice Presidential candidate in opposition, Joe Biden. I mention that because Joe Biden is now running for president, and he helped the Bush administration in the middle of a hot electoral campaign to support Georgia. And he didn't do it for any political advantage, because there was none. Joe Biden did it because it was the right thing to do, and the Bush administration took Joe Biden's advice in the middle of a campaign. It was a remarkable display of bipartisan cooperation under difficult circumstances. And I'm glad that the Bush administration did that. That's what we did instead of the sanctions. Now, you might turn around and say, well, why didn't you do both? And I might even agree with you, except I'd add that in 2008, we weren't as smart about sanctions as we are now. Between 2008 and 2014, we got a lot smarter with sanctions. And in 2014, I was the State Department coordinator for sanctions. So I was the one who helped, with my Treasury colleagues, helped organize the sanctions against Russia. And if I had known then what I know now, I would have argued for the same in 2008. But I didn't know it then.
Thank you for that sincere answer. And my next question would be, what do you think could a country like Georgia do to finally get away of its Soviet past and of Russia's influence?
Well, that depends on the Georgians.
Yeah.
The trick is simple to say and hard to do. So I'll say it, which is the easy part. Build the institutions of democracy. A strong Georgia doesn't mean a strong leader. It means a government with strong institutions that are independent and function according to the rule of law, and it means a strong society with independent institutions that are also strong. So a strong Georgia means strength in that sense, and it's for Georgians to build. It's not for Americans to tell them how. Georgians know perfectly well what a democracy is supposed to look like, and it's now up to the Georgians. This is what you did. You set out to do this during the Rose Revolution, and set out to do this when Georgians voted Saakashvili out of office, right? They did so because they didn't think...
And what now?
Well, it's up to Georgians. You don't need any American telling Georgians what to do. It's up to Georgians. The next elections are coming up, and I can tell you that the American message to the Georgian government and opposition alike is, it's your country, and it's up to Georgians to work things out through democratic means. And because the government has power, it's up to the government to allow for the proper functioning of democracy.
You had meetings here, right? With the government representatives too.
Oh, well, the Americans are meeting with lots of people, yes.
Okay. Could you please share information about those meetings?
I'm with the Atlantic Council, and the Atlantic Council met with Mr. Ivanishvili and with the head of the Georgian parliament and with the Georgian defense minister and with the opposition. It's our habit always to see government and opposition. And by the way, the Georgian ambassador in Washington does a good job seeing both Republicans and Democrats, the administration and the opposition. That's his job. He's right to do it, and he does a good job.
And what was the main message? I'm sorry.
It's perfectly fair to ask, but all I'll say is that our message to the Georgian government and opposition is consistent with what I've been saying to you.
Thank you, sir.
My pleasure.